Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased and privileged to have a very special guest on the broadcast today. Joining me is Bob Smith, a former senator from the state of New Hampshire. He was a senator from that state and is my guest for the entire broadcast today. First of all, before we get into the details of our discussion, let me just welcome Senator Bob Smith to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Chuck. It's indeed a pleasure. I have a lot of family memories of the whole area up in Pensacola because my dad trained there, as many naval aviators did.
Ah, and when was that?
Well, that was a while back. He graduated in the Naval Academy in '38, and then went to Pensacola for flight training, and then he was killed at the end of the war in 1945. So we lost him young, but I don't, of course, have any memories of it, but of the time spent there that he was there. But my mother told me about it and said how much he enjoyed the whole area of Pensacola. I know he used to fish there. He liked to fish.
Right. It's a great area.
It is.
And of course, you were the senator from the state of New Hampshire. Tell us a little bit how you decided to get involved in the Senate campaign, and then a little bit about your tenure there in the U.S. Senate.
Well, I came to New Hampshire after I got out of the Navy. I went to Vietnam and served in Vietnam in the U.S. Navy, was discharged in California, and my wife and I had just been recently married, and we decided to move to New Hampshire. We had actually both grown up in New Jersey, but didn't want to go back there. We always used to say it's a nice place to be from. I don't want to make any New Jersey people angry. But no, I mean, we grew up there and we loved it, but we just decided to move to New Hampshire, where we both taught school for a number of years, and then I went into my own business. I owned and managed a real estate firm and taught school. And in 1984, I ran for the United States House of Representatives. Actually, I ran in 1980 and again in 82 and then in 84 and won on the third try. I'm a good example of those who say if at first you don't succeed, try again.
There you go.
And I was elected to the House and served 3 terms in the U.S. House. And then in 1990, when the seat was vacated by then Senator Gordon Humphrey, I ran and was elected and reelected and left office in 2003. So I served 2 terms in the Senate and 3 terms in the House for a total of 18 years from the live free or die state. It was quite an honor.
I love that slogan, always have.
Yeah, me too.
I've been in New Hampshire a couple times. It's a beautiful state, except in the wintertime. I like it here in the Panhandle for sure from December through March. But
it's beautiful in the wintertime if you just look out the window. But when you got to go outside and it's about 35 below zero, that's a little rough.
Yeah, I hear you. I grew up in northern Indiana, not too far from Chicago, so I've had enough of that kind of weather.
Of course, when that hurricane comes pounding in on Pensacola, we're up there in New Hampshire, we're thinking the same thing.
Yep, I understand. I got you. Well, what was it that appealed to you most about your time in the Senate? I mean, I know that you have a track record as a very conservative senator as far as we think of that term. On the issues, you were one of the more conservative of all of the members of the U.S. Senate during your time. Looking back on it, what are the things that kind of stand out about what you were able to do, or the things that you feel like that you might have had a significant impact in some of these issues pertaining to what we would call conservative principles?
Sure. Well, you know, I was very proud of that record, and I was always in the top 10 or 15 in the House, and I don't mean percent, but I mean 10 or 15 congressmen in the House in terms of my conservative voting record, and in the Senate, usually in the top 5 to top 10. And I think there's a number of issues that I led the fight on, but perhaps most interest to your Christian listeners, pro-life listeners, was my involvement in the abortion debate. I'm trying to be as modest as I can here, but I was the leader in the Senate for a number of years on this issue when others would not take a part in it. I helped to write the partial birth abortion ban language. I wrote a human life amendment that, of course, we couldn't get passed. But I was down on the Senate floor and demonstrated how a partial birth abortion occurred and how terrible it was, and people denied that it happened. But then, of course, I debated some of the big guns against me on it who were pro-abortion, Ted Kennedy, Barbara Boxer, and others.
Right.
So we had some classic debates, but, I'm very proud of it, and I know that I can say when the Lord is ready to take me home that I can say to him, of all other faults that I may have had, I could say, I think I saved a few babies, Lord, because we really did do some hard work on that, and there was another issue where they were selling human body parts from aborted babies. They said that didn't happen either, and we dug up the proof and showed that as well on the Senate floor. Actually showed a price list for each of the body parts.
Wow.
So those are great fights, classic fights, and I think it goes to the heart today of what's wrong with America when you think we've lost 50-some million babies to abortion since Roe v. Wade that we're aware of.
Right.
And to think that all of those children never had a chance to live their dream. They're never going to be a radio commentator. They're never going to be a senator. They're never going to be a doctor. They're never going to be somebody who might discover a cure for cancer or be a pastor. They're never going to have that chance. Their dreams were stopped, and we did it. And we have to bear the responsibility and the stain for that. And I can only hope and pray that someday that we'll see how wrong this was to discard and throw away life like that. It's wrong, and it clearly, I think, goes right to the root cause of some of the major issues that we have today.
Right. As a pastor here in Pensacola, Florida, for over 30 years now, I've tried to teach my people, and with the radio and the writings I've done, et cetera, I try to educate people as to the importance of constitutional government and how that we as Christians should appreciate and defend constitutional government in our country. And I personally believe that much of the problems that we face today are directly related to the fact that we have gotten away from constitutional government. I was pleased to see an article that you wrote here just a few weeks ago. If I remember correctly, the title was, "It's the Constitution, Stupid." Yeah. If I remember right, that's the title of your column.
Right.
Would you go along with this theme here, and how important is it that we, as Christians, as conservatives, and just as ordinary Americans, how important is it that we defend constitutional government?
Well, first of all, let me say I've read some of your articles too, and they're outstanding, and you certainly do a great job with the pen and in terms of espousing conservative values and constitutional principles. I think that there's just no other issue in terms of our republic that is more important. I mean, I don't know how many times, and I've said that in the article that you referred to, that I've heard even presidential candidates talk about this being a democracy. We're not a democracy. We're a republic, a constitutional republic. We elect our leaders. And if we elect bad leaders and they give us bad government, then we get what we deserve. If we fight the battle and we lose, then we have to get up and try to fight it again and again and again and again until we get it right. But there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that allows for abortion. And I think that this is where not only with that issue, but so many other issues where, whether it's the Second Amendment, where people are trying to take away our right to own a firearm, those issues are they're either clearly spelled out in the Constitution that the people have these rights, and or if they're not, then they belong to the states and the people. And it's just amazing to me how far away from the Constitution we have gone. And I think it's not only is it amazing, I think we've gone to the danger level, because I think a lot of people who are serving in office now don't even understand the Constitution.
Right.
Probably haven't read it.
Yeah. I know that's a fact. One of the reasons I know that is one of my sons is an attorney, and he told me that in his entire tenure at law school, that never one time was he required to read the Constitution.
Unbelievable.
And he attended one of the more conservative, one of the better private law schools in the Southeast. And I would venture to say that if you were to quiz the average attorney across the country, including the judges on the benches across this nation, and ask them, have they ever read the Constitution, not to even suggest, have you studied the Constitution, the answer would be no. They don't, and I'm sure the same thing is true with our lawmakers.
It's absolutely true, and you know, we can require a driver's license. We can't require to read the Constitution. I mean, I taught elementary and high school civics, and I'll tell you what, the kids that went in my class, if there are any of them out there listening somewhere around America, they know they learned it.
Right.
Because I taught it to them. And you know, one of the things I used to do, you know, I gave a very difficult Constitution test at the end of the year, and I told them they all had to pass it. And I remember one time my principal in one of the schools that I taught came in and said, you know, that's not a requirement, and you can't do that. I said, just let me handle my job. And so what happened was anybody who flunked the test, I'd go over the questions with them, and I'd say, all right, now do you understand the answer? Yes. Okay, well, then take the test again. So the kids were really fascinated by the fact that they learned it because they took it 2 or 3 times in some cases, but they learned the questions they missed, which is really what it's all about, isn't it?
Right.
Learning, not just some stupid test.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, you know, but I learned from some of the best. I mean, Mel Thompson, the former governor of New Hampshire, was such a great constitutionalist, and he actually was a third-party candidate, or considering a third-party candidacy in the 1970s. And, you know, he told me one time, you stand for principle or you stand for nothing. That was kind of my motto. Constitution, it's all there. I mean, you know, what amazes me, Chuck, is the people that, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on other members of Congress. I mean, there are some wonderful people, outstanding conservatives that serve there, but there are also some that aren't, and some that pretend. And I remember I had 3 votes on judges for the Supreme Court. I had a vote on Clarence Thomas. I had a vote on Justice Ginsburg and Breyer. I voted against Breyer and against Ginsburg and voted for Clarence Thomas, and I've never regretted that vote.
Amen.
And yet I would watch all these great so-called conservative Senate leaders. They go down on the floor and they vote. I mean, Ginsburg, the vote was 97-3.
Mm-hmm.
And you know who the 3 were?
You were one.
I was one. Another one was Don Nichols of Oklahoma, and the other one was Jesse Helms.
Oh,
and I told both of them when we stood down there on the floor, I said, this vote will be remembered as the right vote, I promise you.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But all these other conservatives, you know, Orrin Hatch and all these others, they went out, oh, well, we're going to vote for him, we'll give Clinton this judge or whatever. Well, I mean, how can you say, I mean, if you're not going to put people like that on the court, I mean, if you look back at the people that have hurt us on the Supreme Court, it's been Republican appointees, not Democrat appointees.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I hear so many times, well, we got to have a Republican in the White House for the sake of the judges that he'll.
Sure.
But look, since 1973, and the Republican Party, that the presidents have controlled the majority of the Supreme Court appointments.
Oh, I mean, if you go all the way back to Earl Warren, appointed by Eisenhower, and then we have that wonderful conservative icon, that David Souter from New Hampshire, which I was spared the opportunity to have to vote against this justice on my own in my own state because I wasn't in the Senate yet when he was voted on. But what I tell, my goodness, and that was a Bush appointment, and you could go on and on and on. There was so many disappointments. I mean, really. I mean, I think other than Clarence Thomas and Rehnquist was good, and Scalia, you know, those guys have been very consistent. But beyond that, it's just been a disaster.
Right. You know, one of the things I try to tell people is, you know, especially Christians, when they don't understand, because they don't know our history, they don't understand that our Constitution is predicated on the principles of Scripture. It's predicated, and I've taken some of my columns and I've gone point by point, article by article, and I've shown how that so many of our Bill of Rights, for example, are taken directly from the principles of Scripture. Whenever we talk about constitutional government, we really are talking about the biblical values in the body politic. And if we could ever get Christians to understand that, I think it would help them. Now, when we talk about constitutional government, the other thing that I think is important is what I see coming on down the road here now in the 21st century. I see both parties, Republicans and Democrats, in lockstep toward this globalization. We have the burgeoning North American Union, this NAFTA superhighway coming into being, the merging of Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And both parties, both major parties, seem to be either oblivious to this or directly involved in facilitating this kind of thing. Are you seeing this, and what is your view on this?
Well, yes, I am seeing it, and I fought it for 18 years, and I voted against all, NAFTA and GATT and all those, and Fast Track and all those programs that would give, it was just basically giving away our sovereignty to other nations. It's amazing. I mean, when you stop to think about it, the way NAFTA is recorded, and I just use basically a kind of very simple example. If a Mexican truck with no brakes, loaded with DDT-laden tomatoes, came across the border and was stopped by American authorities for carrying DDT tomatoes and also bad brakes, they could take that to arbitration and have Canada and Mexico outvote the United States on whether or not that truck should be allowed to come into the United States.
Right.
Now, where in the world are we going with that kind of stuff? Our sovereignty is just, they're just giving it away, and people say, well, the American people are evenly split, they're half Democrat and half Republican, and the elections are very close. I don't think that's the case at all. I think what is the case is both parties are the same. There's not a dime's worth of difference between them, and it doesn't matter who gets elected, and that's the way people feel. I mean, they wanted George Bush. That's who they wanted. That's who the Republican. I ran in 1999 for president in the same primary that Bush and others ran in, and it was very clear that everybody wanted Bush, and they got Bush, but he's not a conservative.
No.
And it's unfortunate, but sometimes it's easier to fight the Democrat that where the devil than it is to fight somebody that you have to sometimes protect.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. The two major parties, and from a Christian point of view, I know that most of us we think of our political system as being, quote, a two-party system. You know American history well enough, and I know that there are many listeners that understand that we've always had multiple parties, that the Republican Party that we now know was not existent until Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860. At that time, the Republican Party was a brand new party and controlled nothing in Washington, D.C., and that there has always been an evolution of political parties through our history. Do you think that we are on the verge of perhaps seeing the emergence of some alternative parties to the two-party system?
I'd like to answer that question, yes, but every time I think that's going to happen, we kind of revert back to the same old again, and it's very difficult to get voters to break out of this two-party mold. And, there's not one word about political parties in the United States Constitution, as you well know, not a word. Nobody mentions political party isn't even in the lexicon of the Constitution. And yet these parties evolved based on when Washington and Jefferson basically began the definition of the two, one more being a more federalistic party and the other one being more of a people's party, Jefferson. But you're right. In 1856, when John C. Fremont ran as a Republican, he was the first Republican candidate. That largely grew out of the fact of an outrage, on the issue, the very moral issue of slavery.
Sure.
And the Republican Party grew out of the fact that the Whigs refused to really come all out against slavery. And you have a similar issue today, I think, with abortion. I think abortion is basically the slavery issue, of the 1860s today in 2008, because it is a tremendous moral issue. But if you look at the leadership and the press and the way things are defined in this country today, this nation is in deep trouble. I remember running, and I don't like to be negative because I love Ronald Reagan, and I don't like to be negative about America. I think we need to try to, appeal to the higher hopes of people and the greatness of the people and not run the country into the ground. But I do remember when I was campaigning for president in 1999, and I was in Iowa, and I was out in the middle of nowhere driving along one of those those long country roads, with nothing but farms. And I saw a huge sign, and I never forgot it, and it said, great big letters, "Don't make me come down there," with a big exclamation point, and then below that said God.
Yeah.
And I think that, I know that because I kind of attend many, many different churches. I was born and raised Catholic, but I've been in many of the evangelical churches around the country as I've traveled and met people. And I know that a lot of people think, well, religion is what I got to do in church, and the politics has,
right.
That's got to be left to the politicians. But you get good politicians if you can get good Christians elected, or good moral people who believe in God.
Right.
And I think when we think let God do it and let somebody else do it, then it's not going to.
Right.
I remember a Catholic bishop telling me one time that he was chastising me because we hadn't done enough to stop abortion, and I chastised him right back. I said, I've gone to Catholic Mass for 30 years. I've not heard too many priests talk against abortion in Mass. He said, well, we might lose our parishioners. I said, well, you just told me what the problem is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we have a degree of that in all of our churches.
Oh, sure we do.
The pastors are unwilling to confront controversial issues for fear of losing a giving member or a group of people.
Yeah.
And that's wrong. We are, as pastors and ministers, we are supposed to be men of God. We're supposed to be the trumpeters of truth. And whether people like it or don't like it, we're supposed to preach the truth in season and out of season, and that's our job.
That's right, Chuck.
But
absolutely right on.
Yeah, the preachers have become more politicians than some of the politicians.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to this third party issue, because I really think that more and more people are beginning to realize what you said a minute ago, that there's not a dime's worth of difference between. Of course, that goes back to the days of George Wallace. But it's true. I mean, when issue after issue after issue, you look at no matter who you vote for, and you think you're going to get change, you think you're going to get a new direction, but nothing happens. Nothing changes. It's the same old direction.
Exactly. And let me give you two quick examples. If you go back to the Vietnam War, 58,000 guys were killed, and no war was declared. And I would ask you to ask any of those guys who survived the war, including me, or anybody else who went and was killed, and maybe ask their families whether or not they were in a war. And then we had Korea before that, an undeclared war, and now Iraq, an undeclared war. I mean, Congress has got to step up to the plate. If you're going to ask people to go shed blood, when the president asks them to do it, it should be with a declaration of war. It doesn't matter whether you're for or against the Iraq war in terms of its principles. If you're going to ask people to serve and die in a cause that you feel is worthy of attacking another country, then you have got to ask for a declaration of war, and Congress has got to give it. That's what the Constitution says.
Absolutely right.
And yet thousands of men are dying, and women, and yet we just kind of just rumble along, as if we don't know where we're going. But a third party, Chuck, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just is so difficult to break out of that mold, and I think it's probably going to be candidate driven if it ever happens. I mean, you look at the way Obama has kind of caught on the Democrat primary, nothing to do with his politics, but I mean just the way he kind of seemed to catch on to the voters, to the Democrat voters.
I got you.
I think you're going to need a person who can, a Reagan-esque kind of person who can do that, and maybe Wallace did it for a while, but he was pretty limited in terms of, in the 60s, he was limited in terms of where his scope was. But the difficulty, as I see it, is winning electoral votes. I mean, it's stacked against you. You have to get a plurality. You've got to get at least 35% in a state to win that state's electoral votes. And Ross Perot got 19%, but he kind of went a little nutty in the end.
Right, he did. Well, but
I don't think it's impossible, but it bothers me, and I'll put some of the blame right on the doorstep of the people like Pat Robertson and people like that who say, well, and the National Right to Life, who said, well, we're going to endorse Fred Thompson because he's the only pro-life candidate that can win.
Yeah.
So much for that theory.
Yeah, right. Well, and that all goes back to this concept of trying to pick a winner instead of trying to pick the principled person to represent your convictions.
Chuck, you're so right on that. I mean, I can remember debating Ted Kennedy on many issues, abortion for one. I never minded it because I knew where the guy stood.
Right.
And I didn't agree with him, but I respected his right to take a position. You always knew where he stood. I'd rather debate somebody like that than some milquetoast in the middle who doesn't know where they stand and they're trying to play both sides, you know.
Exactly right. We've only got a couple minutes left. What's the future for Bob Smith?
Well, as we sit, I know we're recording this earlier than when this is being broadcast. I honestly don't know the answer, Chuck. I've talked to a number of folks in the Constitutional Party who've been very gracious with their time and effort and providing information to me. It's a big decision for me to do because, you know, I served for 18 years. There's a lot of family sacrifices that go along with that. And, you know, I just became a grandfather, and I'm beginning to enjoy that as well. So a lot of personal decisions that I have to make, and I'm trying to sort through all this. And the answer is now I don't know whether I'm going to be a candidate or not. But I wish I could say yes for sure. But as I sit here now, I can't give you an answer. I don't know.
All right. What would be the word of counsel from someone who's been in the inside of both the House and the Senate in Washington, D.C., a long-time activist for Christian/conservative causes? What would be the word of advice and encouragement you would give to the Christian folks and the others who are listening to this interview right now on radio? What word of encouragement can you give to them pertaining to some of these issues that we've discussed here this hour?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stick to your principles. Don't cave on your principles. I mean, I told my staff when I left the Senate on the last day of my service that if you forget everything else about me, just when you come to that path in the road, and you can take the road, you know, much traveled or the one more difficult, take the one that is the most principled. Mm-hmm. That's the most difficult, so be it. If it's the easiest, so be it. But take the principled road, and you'll never, ever regret it. And I think it's important that people who serve I think men and women, God's children, have many responsibilities. And I used to say that what I would like to see on my tombstone would be, he served his God, he served his country, he served his family, and he tried to do them all with the best of his ability. That's really what it is. I mean, you can serve your country and your God and your family. You can do them all.
Amen. We got to end it with that.